Hello and welcome to the next of our lectures. This is quite a short lecture just on our introduction to corporate governance. What we're going to look at here is a little bit on the development of corporate governance, so how it's come about, some of the problems that there are in corporate governance, and then just the contents that we're going to look at over the next few lectures, just so you're aware of all of the different areas we're going to see. So remember, the key concepts with corporate governance are that corporate governance is that system of business governance that we've talked about, governing the business in the interests of the shareholders and in the interests of the stakeholders. So there are various corporate governance codes that are in existence. So some of the codes are principles based and some of the codes are prescriptive. Now, what does that mean? Principles-based codes give us a set of principles by which to work towards. They're not rules. What they are guidelines for that business to try and implement. So principles-based codes are not rules and regulations. They have no authority. There's no fine or anything like that if you don't implement the code. For prescriptive codes, these are required. These are legal rules. So good examples of these are principles-based code would be the UK Corporate Governance Code. So it is called comply or explain. So we comply with it or we explain why we didn't comply with it. Now that means that investors can make a decision based on your corporate governance compliance, whether they want to invest in you or not, whether they trust you as a business. And that's an incentive for the businesses that are supposed to apply it to apply it. When it comes to prescriptive codes, that's an example would be Sarbanes-Oxley in the US. And we're going to look in detail at some of the requirements of Sarbanes-Oxley. It's very prescriptive, it's rules-based. If you don't comply with it, you risk going to jail or fines or various other aspects that can happen. So those are the different types of codes that there are, principles-based and prescriptive. We're going to look at each. These codes came about really as a response to corporate failures. The major ones being Enron and WorldCom. So once those happened, authorities realised that one of the key reasons for them failing was a lack of corporate governance, a lack of corporate responsibility. So this was a response to that. These codes came into place to try and enforce that corporate responsibility. Ultimately, what we want is stable investments for shareholders, particularly when we're thinking about institutional investors like pension funds, insurance companies, etc. They need stable investments and we need a stable stock market in order that our financial system is viable. Corporate governance codes are also an attempt to ensure that corporate reporting standards are upheld so that there's a responsibility within the organisation to apply those standards. So those are some of the key concepts that we'll see as we go through. Looking first of all at the UK Code. The UK Code is really an amalgamation of various different reports that came about at different times. That started off in 1992 with the Cadbury Report. So the Cadbury Report suggested various different corporate reporting and corporate governance requirements. For example, the split of the CEO and chairman function. Also communication with the shareholders and stakeholders, disclosure of information, and that comply or explain concept. So that brought in the principles-based code, as in comply with it or explain in your financial statements why you haven't done so. Moving on to 1995 then, we saw the Greenberry Report. This was focusing particularly on directors' pay and how that pay should be not excessive but enough to retain the directors. And again, we'll look at that when we look at the Remuneration Committee. Turnbull in 1998 introduced responsibility for internal controls, which again we'll look at in more detail throughout the module. And Hampel in 1998 brought in all of these different reports and brought them together into one code. We then had Higgs, Tyson and Smith in 2003, which focused on the auditors and the independence of non-executive directors. Lastly then, we had the Walker Report very recently in 2010, and it decided that the amalgamation of all of those codes and reports, which was now called the UK Combined Code, because it combined all of those different reports, it was fit for purpose. So it said it was fit for purpose, and they reinforced the principles that were contained in it. And those are the principles that we're going to focus on as we look through our corporate governance requirements. That combined code is now called the UK Corporate Governance Code. So the Walker Report in 2010 renamed it the UK Corporate Governance Code. So as I said, we'll look at that corporate governance code as we look at the different areas that are covered by corporate governance. Just to outline some of the problems that we have when we're trying to implement corporate governance requirements. Well, the first one is that it will create additional bureaucracy within the organisation. We've got to understand that, but we've also got to accept it. You know, corporate governance is there to make sure that that system of business governance is fit for purpose. It's impossible to do that without adding a little bit of bureaucracy. So that's a slight problem, but it's a necessary one. Another problem is that it's one size for all. These principles apply to all listed companies. So we don't really have it tailored towards specific companies or specific industries. So it's one size for all, and that can be a little bit of a drawback because we don't get that tailored code for specific industries. It is the case that corporate governance codes tend to react to rather than foresee problems. So usually corporate governance codes are adjusted or indeed come into existence as a response to previous failures. So rather than trying to see what the potential failures could be in the future and try and address those problems, corporate governance codes are usually a reaction to some failure or another. Also, corporate governance codes can be circumvented. So, for example, through collusion on the board or through a decision on the board not to implement the corporate governance requirements. And another problem is that corporate governance codes can reduce the risk taking in an organisation. Now, you might think that that's a good thing. You may think, well, less risk, well, that's good for shareholders because less risk means that their shareholding is more safe, their investment is secure. However, if you think about it like this, we must take risks to make a return. The higher the risk that's taken in an organisation, the more return they're able to generate. So we may actually be restricting the return that's available to shareholders by reducing the risk taking within an organisation through the implementation of corporate governance codes. However, we need to have a balance there. We need to balance the risks that are being taken with the code that's in place and the return that we can provide to the shareholders. So when we're looking at this corporate governance code, primarily we're looking at the UK Corporate Governance Code. The contents of that are, and we'll look at each of these in detail, Section A, which covers leadership. So that will cover the board responsibilities, the split of the board between executive and non-executive directors, the role of the board and what they're required to do. Section B looks at the effectiveness of the board. So that's the skills that are there, the nomination of the board through the nomination committee, the induction that's provided by the corporation to the people who are appointed to the board, and the performance measurements that are taken to make sure that the board is effective. Section C then moves on to accountability of the board, focusing on internal controls and making a balanced assessment of the business each year. Section D surrounds remuneration, which needs to be transparent and disclosed at all times. And Section E focuses on shareholder relations, particularly the dialogue between the company and its shareholders and communication to shareholders and stakeholders alike. So that is an introduction to corporate governance. We're now going to go ahead over the next few lectures to look at each of these areas in detail, to think about the leadership in the organisation, the effectiveness of the board, the accountability and remuneration, and the shareholder relations. And in that way, we can build up a full picture as to the corporate governance requirements.